Hey there nation, welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to Cheap Shots, the ultimate series for miniature wargamers who want stunning tabletop quality miniatures without breaking the bank. You don't need expensive supplies to make your miniatures stand out on the battlefield, so follow along as we prove that amazing results don't have to come with a hefty price tag. And by following the tips, techniques, and materials that we suggest on this video, we'll give you a grand total investment of $45.40 to paint your miniatures up to a beautiful tabletop standard. And when you compare that from Army Painter as well as Citadel's total price tag of $225.60, will inevitably you save $180.20 at the same time. So this is the end result of what your miniatures will look like. So with that being said, let's talk about how to paint up some Stimmers as well as Forgeborn. So the first thing you have to do, of course, is to assemble your miniatures. You can assemble your miniatures any way that you like. In this situation, it's kind of do with the general two storm welder wielding Forgeborn, as well as two Forgeborn armor with rock saws, and of course I did a Stimmer with paired pulverizers and another Stimmer with paired assault grenade launchers. Now once you have your miniatures assembled, the next thing you gotta do, of course, is to prime your miniatures. And because we're using a quick paint method using oil wash, I decided to use a white primer on these miniatures. Now priming does a couple of things. The first thing that priming actually does is it gives a good surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to when you paint your miniatures throughout the entire painting process. The problem is if you paint miniatures directly with acrylic paints onto bare plastic without using primer, the slightest bit of friction will cause the paint to rub off, which will of course ruin the finish of your miniature. So priming is a very important step. The second thing that priming also does too is it actually has an impact on the vibrancy of the colors that you put on your miniatures. Traditionally speaking, the more vibrant the paint job, the lighter primer you want to use, and of course the more subdued paint job, the darker primer you want to use. So in this situation, we're using flat white primer. I use Rust-Oleum flat white primer. I get this at my local Walmart. And once you get your miniatures primed up, you're ready to move on to your base coats. So the very first detail we're going to paint on these miniatures are on the flesh. Now these guys are House Goliath gangers from Necromunda, so there's a lot of flesh exposed on these guys. They have exposed arms, exposed faces, some of them have exposed chests and shoulders. So to create a variety of flesh tones in this gang, I decided to use three different colors. I painted two of my Forgeborn in flesh by Apple Barrel Paint. I picked out one of my Stimmers to have burnt umber by Apple Barrel Paint, and for the remainders I used nutmeg brown by Apple Paint as well. You can get this at your local Walmart for very low price. You just make sure you want to put two solid base coats of this all over the flesh that's exposed on these miniatures. Make sure you get two thin coats on that so that we have a good base to work off of. Now the nice part about this, you don't need to be particularly neat at this point. You're just putting down the base coat. Just make sure you got a good solid foundation for your flesh. So now that we're done doing the base coat for the flesh on miniatures, the next thing we gotta do, of course, is to do a dry brush. Now dry brushing actually does a couple of things. It creates the illusion of depth on your miniatures by providing highlighting on your miniatures. By doing dry brushing, what ends up happening is that the pigments of the paint adhere to the raised surface of the miniature while leaving that darker color in the recess, adding that illusion of depth. So for the two fighters that we did in Apple Barrel Flesh earlier, we're actually gonna dry brush those guys in Delta Sarin Coat Peaches and Cream. You can get it at your local Hobby Lobby. It's a nice pale flesh color. And as you can see, it catches upon the raised surface of the miniature while leaving that darker flesh tone in the recesses. For the fighter that we did in Burnt Umber, we're going to dry brush them with Territorial Beige or Apple Barrel Paint. And for the last three fighters that we did the base coat in Nutmeg Brown, we're going to dry brush those guys in Flesh by Apple Barrel Paint. And once you have that dry brush done, you're ready to move on to the next step. Now if you'll notice, there is a little bit of a kind of pastel, kind of chalky appearance to these miniatures. Don't stress out if you do see that. When we get to the oil washing stage, that's going to transition blend those transitions together and give her that chalky appearance. So next detail we're going to start working on next is the clothing for these fighters. So for three of these fighters, I decided to pick that out their trousers in two thin coats of pavement paint. You can get this at your local Walmart. It's made by Apple Barrel Paint. I did it from one of the Stimmers as well as two of the Forgeborn. One guy who's carrying a rock saw, the other one is carrying a storm welder to give that kind of color variety. And for the other three fighters, I picked out their trousers in two thin coats of burnt umber as well. And the reason why I decided to go with these colors is because we're going to go with a kind of a turquoisey kind of bluish color for their armor, and these colors will contrast nicely with the armor that we're going to use for these fighters. And next, of course, we're going to dry brush their trousers so that way we can crash those details by creating that illusion of depth. We're going to use Pale Gray by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for the fighters we did in Payment Paint earlier, and for the ones that we did in Burnt Umber, we're going to use Territorial Beige for them. As you can see, it brings a lot of the details we couldn't see, like the creases of the pants, the folds of the fabric, cargo pockets, that sort of thing. The next detail we're going to pick out next are on the leather goods, things like the boots that these fighters are wearing, as well as some of the straps and cabling that's around their bodies. So for some of these guys, we're going to pick those details out in Pavement by Apple Barrel Paint, and for the other remaining fighters, we're going to pick out that detail in Moccasin Brown by Anita's Acrylic. You can get the Moccasin Brown at your local Hobby Lobby as well. As you can see, those two leather goods kind of contrast nicely. For the fighters that we did in Burnt Umber for their trousers, we're going to use Pavement Paint for their leather goods, and for the ones that we use for pavement for their trousers, we're going to use Moccasin Brown, because that way it contrasts against the colors of their trousers that we used. And once again, we're going to do one more dry brushing on the leather goods. For the leather goods that we did in Pavement, we're going to dry brush that in Pale Gray by Folk Art, and for the ones that we did in Moccasin Brown, we're going to dry brush those with Khaki Paint by Apple Barrel Paint. Now for two of these fighters, specifically the Forgeborn, we have two female fighters for the Forgeborn, so because of they're wearing tank tops underneath their armor plating. So for that detail, we're going to pick out that shirt in two thin layers of Pewter Gray by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get it at your local Walmart. It's a nice dark gray color that also contrasts nicely and also complements the darker color trousers that we use for these fighters as well. At the same time, it'll also be a nice contrasting color for the blue colors that we're going to use for the armor that they're going to be wearing. And speaking of armor, the next major detail that these miniatures are wearing is the armor that they're using. And once again, we're going to divide this gang into two different sides. Half of these guys we're going to paint up in Pale Blue by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get that at your local Walmart, and the other half we're going to use True Teal by Apple Barrel Paint as well. Now, the reason why we're using these colors is for one very simple reason. The House Goliath fighters that I did earlier, years ago, for my Necromunda battle reports, I painted that their armor in kind of like a powder blue, and half of the gang in like a kind of like a light turquoise kind of color. And the reason why I chose that color is because it's not really a color you see very often on Goliath gangs. A lot of people like to use reds, oranges, and yellows, which is perfectly fine, nothing wrong with that, but I wanted to create a little bit more diversity in my color schemes for my miniatures, so I went with like a blue tone for those guys, and I wanted to use these, carry on that motif of using various shades of blue and teal for this gang, and that's the reason why I picked these colors for these fighters. Now, the reason why you want to do that is because you want to make sure that your gang is not too uniformed. I mean, don't get me wrong, gangs have gang colors just like how they do today, and they have exactly the same thing in Necromunda, but you don't want to make everybody the exact same color or the exact same paint scheme, because this is Necromunda and your fighters are very much individual people with their own style and the way own style of dress and the way that they carry themselves. So you want to create a color tone that kind of unifies the gang. In this case, it'd be kind of like a bluish teal color, but you want to add enough variety to it to make it look like these guys stand out as individuals as well. So they're not exact copies of one another. They're not exactly an army, they're a gang, so they're going to be a little bit of style variations between them. So once you get a good base layer of two thin coats of both colors on your fighters, the next thing I gotta do, of course, is work on some more of the armor plating. So the armor plating will be focusing on the gauntlets, specifically on the Forgeborn. Each of the Forgeborn characters have these kind of like rubber looking gauntlets that they wear for the weapons that they're carrying. So to bring out that detail, we're going to use two thin coats of Tuscan Teal with Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this paint at your local Walmart as well. It's a nice complementary color to the blue armor for half of the fighters, as well as for the teal armor that we did for the half of the fighters as well. But there's enough of a shade difference to where that detail kind of stands out on its own. Now, regardless of what color we use for the armor, we are going to use the exact same color for the dry brush for all of it, and that color is going to be Dutch Aqua by Folk Art. You can give this to your local Walmart, and we're going to dry brush directly all the armor panels that we did in blue, as well as in teal, as well as the gauntlets of the Forgeborn as well. Now, the dry brush, you can see, brings a lot of those details we couldn't see before, things like individual armor panels, studs that are in their armor, as well as little mechanisms and machinery that's built into their armor. And once we get done with that dry brush, we can move on to our next detail. And that details on the leather straps. So these guys have leather straps around their gauntlets, around their leg greaves. They also have it on the straps of their shoulders, as well as for their war gear. So because of that, for the guys that we did in brown colored trousers or darker colored skin tones, we're going to use Pavement Paint in order to bring out those details. And for the rest of the gang, we're going to use Territorial Beige, so that way you can bring out that detail that you can see it quite nicely against the rest of the colors that the gang has. So the next detail we're going to work on the rucksack. So 2 of these Forgeborn are wearing rucksacks. So to bring out that detail, we're going to use 2 thin coats of moccasin brown by Anita's acrylic. We're just going to put 2 thin layers directly all over the straps of the packages of the backpacks, and then we're ready to move on to our dry brush. And to bring out those details, we're going to dry brush some of the thin layer of khaki paint real quick so that we can see out a lot of those details. And as you can see, we have if you look in the background there, you can see the rest of the Goliath gang that I painted up earlier a couple of years ago. So as you can see, that I'm kind of using them as a reference in order to create some comparisons between both sides as well. So that way they kind of look the same, but at the same time look kind of individualistic as well. So the last major detail we're going to work on these fighters are on the weapons that these characters are carrying, and the color we're going to use is Anita's acrylic True Red. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby, and the reason why we're using this red color is because the red is a nice contrasting color with all the blues and teals that we have in this army. It helps for this gang. At the same time, it's also a nice contrasting color, all the blues and teals that we're using as well, and it's very much an eye-catching detail. Not to mention, this is exactly the same color we use for the weapons that we used for the Goliath gang earlier that we painted, so it's a kind of nice little way to kind of make these guys connect with the rest of their fighters. And the next thing we're going to do, of course, is to dry brush all the parts that we did in red earlier. So, for example, the handles of the pulverizers, for example, the weapon casings of all the guns, as well as the rock saws these characters are carrying, the power cells of the storm welders on the backpacks of 2 of the Forgeborn. We're just going to dry brush that real quick in a thin layer of Tropic Orange by Apple Pearl paint. You can get this at your local Walmart, and once again, it brings a lot of those details we couldn't see before, like the things like the individual rivets, armor panels on their weapons, little diodes, and things of that nature. And because this is a Goliath gang, we're going to focus on the hair now of all the Forgeborn. Now we're going to go with this kind of punk rocker look for the hair color, just because it is Necromunda and these guys are Goliaths. Not to mention all these fighters have mohawks, so of course we're going to give them some kind of crazy looking punk colors to use for their hair because, you know, that's the way these guys are supposed to look. So for one of the Forgeborns, the rock saw, we're going to paint her mohawk in Concord Grape. For the other guy armed with the storm welder, we're going to paint his mohawk in Chris Apple. For the other Forgeborn armed with the rock saw, we're going to paint his mohawk in King's Gold. And then lastly, for the last Forgeborns armed with the storm welder, we're going to pick out their mohawk in 2 thin layers of Diva Pink. And you just put 2 thin layers of all these colors on their mohawks. They look absolutely amazing. And by the way, you can get these colors at your local Walmart. So now that we're done with most of the details, the next thing we're going to do now is start working on the metallic elements. So we're going to use gunmetal gray for all the silver accents, so things like blades of weapons, barrels of guns, that sort of thing as well. Same thing with some of the energy cells that we see on these fighters, as well as some of the details on their armor panels. We're also going to use Anita's Aged Copper. You can get that at your local Hobby Lobby. We're going to use this for things like battery packs, as well as magazines or some of the weapons. We're also going to use Deco Arts Emperor's Gold, which you get at your local Walmart for all the things that we want to be golden, for example, like House Goliath iconography, little details on their weapons as well as their armor panels. And the last thing we'd also use too is Copper by Folk Art. We can get this at your local Walmart. We use things for like barrels of the guns, for example, the power cabling that goes from their storm welders to their rucksacks to battery packs, that sort of thing. By adding a variety of different metallic colors like this, it adds a lot of visual interest to our fighters. And the last detail we're going to work on our Forgeborn are some of the power cables that go from the storm welders directly to their power packs. And to bring out that detail, we're going to use Kiwi by Apple Pearl paint. You can get this at your local Walmart. It's a beautiful, vibrant, kind of neon, greenish, yellowish color that also stands out quite nicely. We're going to use this for both the power packs as well as for the little cabling. It looks like little ignition tubes that are attached to their storm welders as well. And now it's time for us to focus on the color schemes for our Stimmers as well. Once again, we're using gunmetal gray for all the things like the blades of the weapons, the chains that are hanging off of their armor, as well as some of the armor paneling on these characters as well. We're going to use Anita's acrylics, Aged Copper for things like power packs on the weapons, for example, so like the grenade launcher character. We're going to use that for the twin circular magazines on his rucksack. We're going to use Deco Arts Emperor Gold for some of the finer details like the rim with the armor paneling on some of these fighters, as well as like one of the shoulder pads, as well as House Goliath iconography. We're also going to use Copper by Folk Art as well to pick out things like the power pack on the pulverizers, for example, the kneecaps and elbow caps of these guys' armor as well, magazine tubes, that sort of thing. And the very last detail we're painting on these guys, of course, are on the chemical that are on these guys, because these guys are stimmers, which means that they are juiced up with chems as well as chemical enhancing steroids. So for all the tubing that we're seeing on these characters, as well as the tanks of where the chemical vats are being held at for these fighters, we're going to pick that 2 thin layers of kiwi. We're also going to use the same color for the eyes of the fighters as well, to make it look like their eyes are glowing from the chems that they're ingesting from their rucksacks. So now that we got all the details done for the fighters, the next thing we have to do now is start working on the bases. Now for the bases on this one, I just put 2 thin layers of copper directly on top of the base. The reason why I chose that color is because it's exactly the same method I used to paint the Goliath gangers earlier a couple of years ago. So we're going to use exactly that same method for these guys as well. So just put 2 thin layers of copper directly all over the texturing on the bases. And the next detail we're going to use, of course, is we're going to use Anniversary Silver by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart, and we're just going to use it like a dry brush directly on top of the base. Now, I will warn you guys, the Anniversary Silver does have a little bit of a blue tinge to it, and that's the reason why we're using it. It kind of creates some visual interest on the copper decking these guys are walking on. At the same time, it also makes it look like it's weathered and worn, like it's been scraped a little bit, and it has this kind of like this weird kind of bluish glow to it as well, so it makes it look a little bit alien. So now that we're done with our base coats and our dry brush, the next thing we gotta do, of course, is an oil wash. Now the oil washing stage is that we use an oil over oil wash over the entirety of the miniature, as well as the bases they're standing on as well. Now, if you, the oil washing does a couple of things. The first thing that it does, of course, is that it actually seeps directly into the recesses of the miniatures and brings out a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier. So things like gaps in the armor panels, for example, the individual strands of hair, musculature, the fold of the fabric, the individual mechanical industrial look on the bases. It does a lot of brings a lot of those details we couldn't see before. Another thing that the oil washing also does as well is it blends together the transitions between our dry brushing as well as our base coating. If you notice, that chalky pastel texture is now gone, because now the colors have kind of smoothed out with that oil washing, blending out those transitions and makes it a little bit more organic and not as much as a chalky kind of rough look. And the last thing that the oil wash also does too is it also darkens down the vibrancy and the value of the colors that we put on these miniatures. It's also why we use such bright colors in the very beginning, because that oil wash is going to darken that down. Now for this oil washing step, a lot of people like to use Army Painter Strong Tone, which is a wonderful product that does exactly as advertised. The only problem though is it costs $32 a can, whereas Middlebox Polyshade Acrylic and Mission Oak costs about $7.99 at your local Walmart, which is significantly cheaper. All you gotta do is you gotta apply it like a wash all over the entirety of the miniatures and let it sit and rest and dry. And the reason why that's the case is because there is polyurethane in it, just like there is polyurethane in Army Painter Strong Tone. So you do have to let that product dry and cure for about 24 hours, and when you do, you have a polyurethane finish that protects your miniatures from chipping as well as fading. The only problem, of course, is that you have a high gloss finish, and if you do like that high gloss finish, you can skip putting a matte varnish on it, but I like my miniatures a little bit more matte. Either way though, my recommendation for you is to use this at the very last step of your painting process. Stop for the rest of the time that you're painting, wait a whole day and come back, and you'll be able to pick up right after you left off. Now, the second to last detail we got to do for these miniatures is to rim the bases of these miniatures, and for that I like to use Folk Art's Skyline by Folk Art. It's a nice, beautiful bluish gray color that I use for all of the skirmishing game that we actually have in our studio's collection. I use it for both Mordheim as well as for our studio's Necromunda collections, and the reason why is because I think it kind of matches what an urban environment would look like for that, and that's the reason why I use that color. And once you get done with that rimming of the bases, next we got to do is our matte varnish. So like I said earlier, the matte varnish does leave a high shine, high gloss sheen on your miniatures because of that polyurethane. Now if you do like that candy coating, you can skip this next step. However, I like more of a matte finish on my miniatures, so because I use a can of matte varnish spray by Krylon, you can get this at your local Walmart. Just do it once over real quick with the Krylon matte varnish to reduce the sheen of that high gloss finish, and we are done with our miniatures. So once again, here's the end result that we showed our miniatures earlier with that beautiful tabletop standard using our really cheap crafting materials. And so now that we're done talking about exactly how we paint up our miniatures using the cheapskate method, let's talk about exactly what you'll need to buy from both Army Painter as well as Citadel if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using those name brand paints instead. So this is the shopping list that you'll need to buy from both Army Painter as well as Citadel to achieve the exact same results we did, but using their name brand products instead. So you'll need to buy a can of Corex White Spray for $24, as well as the colors Emperor's Children, Thunderhawk Blue, Averland Sunset, Temple Guard Blue, Genestealer Purple, Teclis Blue, Luganeth Orange, Bugman's Glow, Cadian Flesh Tone, Morghast Bone, Baylor Brown, Hellion Green, Moot Green, Slanesh Gray, Eshin Gray, Flay One Flesh, Mephiston Red, XV88, Rust Gray, and Ulthuan Gray, and each of those colors costs $4.55 per pot. You also need to buy a pot of Wildwood, Brass Scorpion, Lead Belcher, Retributor Armor, Screaming Bell, Iron Breaker, and Aethermatic Blue, and all those colors cost $7.80 a piece. You also need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone for $32, as well as a can of Munitorian Varnish for $24. So assuming that you're purchasing everything for the very first time with this Army Painter Citadel method, you're talking about a grand total investment of $225.60 to paint up your miniatures the exact same way we did, but using these name brand paints instead. If you go with our cheapskate total, which is $45.40, you end up with a grand total savings of $180.20. So in conclusion, if you're looking at a way to save money on your miniatures wargaming hobby, may I suggest switching to cheaper craft paints to paint up your miniatures. After all, you get similar results at a fraction of the price, and due to the way things are going with the global economy, it seems like a good way to actually save some money on your wargaming hobby. So there you guys have it. This is how you guys can cheaply and quickly paint up your House Goliath Stimmers, as well as your Forge Born for Necromunda. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. You guys' input is invaluable to us as always. I am Commander Cheapskate. This has been this video. I will catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.